mind taking that on notice, even if it's just referring us to what you consider as relevant, that would be very helpful. Going back to what Senator Fawcett asked you in terms of budgetary constraints, and there's, as I understand it, you've mentioned the Chicago Convention and international obligations we have in terms of ICAO 13, Annex 13, in terms of the obligation to appropriately investigate aircraft accidents. Do you think that these budgetary constraints would of necessity constrain either the number of investigations or the depth of those investigations in terms of the work of the ATSB?
Over time, Senator, the consequences of budget reductions, as I said, is a reduction in the number of staff, and that means that some of those staff will be investigators. We will have fewer investigators available to us, therefore we will be able to do less. We can improve productivity and efficiency in the organisation, but there's a limit.
And Mr Murdoch, can I ask you, if given our international obligations to properly and thoroughly investigate aircraft accidents, if the ATSB said, look, we can't do our job properly because, God forbid, there's been a spate of accidents or an increase in workload in relation to accident investigations, would the government feel obliged to make sure that there were the appropriate resources to fulfil our international obligations, or let's say that's the budget, too bad?
Senator, certainly I think it would be very much, as Mr Dolan's indicated, he and I discuss regularly his budget position. We are clear if there was pressure on the organisation, there is no doubt Mr Dolan would go to the Minister and outline the issues, and the government would consider those matters. I have no doubt of that. There are clearly financial pressures and fiscal pressures on all agencies across the Commonwealth, but I think it would be a case that the government would, as they have done in the past, would look very carefully at resourcing reductions in key safety agencies.
All right, this goes to another resource issue, and this relates to the ditching of the PelAir flight back in November 2009. The basis, without rehashing the report, but the basis of the ATSB refusal to retrieve the cockpit voice recorder is based on an interpretation of ICAO Annex 13. Is that a fair assessment?
That's one element of it, Senator, as I tried to make clear at the time. Another consideration is in my role as Chief Executive of the ATSB with responsibilities under a range of legislation, including the Financial Management and Accountability Act, as to the efficient, effective and ethical use of Commonwealth resources.
So what takes priority, the issues of the Financial Management and Accountability Act or ICAO Annex 13 in terms of our international obligations with respect to aviation safety and accident investigation?
I'm required, Senator, in my role to balance my obligation under the Transport Safety Investigation Act to undertake the functions of the organisation consistent with a range of international instruments, including Annex 13. But I'm also equally required to have regard to the efficient and effective use of Commonwealth resources. And they're the decisions that we have to make on a regular basis in terms of how we undertake our work. So
Mr Dolan, if you're required to equally assess both, where it is finally balanced, what wins out? Is it our international obligations to appropriately and thoroughly investigate aviation accidents, or is it budgetary constraints?
The question we will always need to ask ourselves, Senator, is how we meet our obligations, what the necessary level of investigation is, and we have to have regard in that to the availability of resources. For major investigations, there will come a point where it's clearly not within our annual budget to deal with the consequences of it, and that's certainly the position with any major accident. We already have arrangements in place that were there a major accident that has an ongoing above the ordinary call on our investigations, we can ask the government for additional funding. But we're always making calls about what we do within our existing resources and what constitutes the major investigation that would require an approach to the government for further funding.
So you haven't reconsidered your interpretation of ICAO Annex 13 in relation to the retrieval of the cockpit voice recorder in respect to the PelAir ditching?
More broadly speaking, and specifically to that question, Senator, the recommendations that came out of the committee's report as they referred to the ATSB as an independent agency will be reviewed by the Commission of the ATSB, myself and my fellow commissioners. And so it's not just a decision for myself, but a decision for the three of us acting collectively in accordance with our legal responsibility.
But in the year that, in the financial year that the PelAir ditching occurred, were you within, you didn't actually, you were within budget, weren't you? You went over budget at the end of that year.
We had a surplus at the end of that year, correct?
So you can't say that the decision not to retrieve the cockpit voice recorder was due to budgetary constraints, because by the end of that financial year you still had a surplus.
I still had to have regard to the likely and projected costs of recovery and what my available resources were and what I needed to do with them, Senator.
I mean, would your view be in any way altered, and it's another jurisdiction, but I think the ATSB is involved in Indonesia and does provide assistance. In the recent crash of a Lion Air 737 off Bali earlier this year, the cockpit voice recorders was retrieved at a great cost and difficulty, even though the crew survived, because Annex 13 requires it and the international community expects it. Is there any possibility that you will reconsider the decision not to retrieve the cockpit voice recorder in relation to the PelAir incident?
There is a possibility, in fact there is the certainty that the Commissioners collectively will reconsider it, and that's part of our review of the recommendations of the committee, and
Right.
once we have done that we will report back on the results of our consideration.
Right, and when will that be reconsidered, do you think?
At this stage, and I need to have further discussions with my fellow Commissioners, we have a scheduled formal Commission meeting on the 24th of July, and that's at this stage when we would expect to consider all the recommendations of the committee.
And is there a possibility, and I think Senator Edwards raised this during the inquiry, but is there a possibility that the ATSB will consider reopening that investigation based on the findings of the Senate Committee report?
We have a recommendation in front of us from the committee, Senator, that says that we should do that, and we will have due regard to that recommendation.
But don't you, finally in relation to this, if I may, Chair, the committee has criticised the ATSB in relation to its report in relation to the PelAir ditching. You're now in a position to reconsider whether you ought to reopen the investigation, which don't you think that do you think it's appropriate that an independent person, outsourced by the ATSB, make recommendations as to whether it ought to be reopened, an aviation expert, given that there's a fundamental conflict? It sort of sees the judging Caesar in the context of what ought to be done with respect to reopening the report, the investigation.
I hear what you're saying, Senator. That's a matter obviously I would have to discuss with my fellow Commissioners as to what information and advice they may wish to rely on in reconsidering the decision that's been made.
Or do you think it's appropriate that there ought to be some independent assessment as to whether the investigation be reopened, given that there would be, on the face of it, an apparent conflict of the board effectively having to make a call as to whether it should be critical of its previous report?
No, I don't, Senator. I see that our responsibilities as the Commissioners of the ATSB in meeting the functions of the organisation are something that we are required to appropriately consider, and what information we draw on to make those considerations I think is a matter for us.
Senator, if I may, I think again,
we're seriously considering weighing all the information that's been available through the Senate Committee and other material that might come to light, and making a decision as we're required to do under our legislation.
Senator, perhaps if I may add, clearly these are matters which the government will need to consider in the light of the Senate
trying to give you
Committee's
some
report.
guidance.
We do appreciate that. I mean, Mr Dolan is quite correctly putting the position of the Commission in terms of its legislation. The matters that have been raised in the report and the issues both Senator Xenophon and Senator Edwards have just raised are matters that we'll put to the Minister as part of the government's response.
Thank you.